The self-help guru or the anti-woke, far right-leaning individual will basically attribute way too much free will and too much agency to the person suffering mental illnesses, as well as too much introspective capacity. Whereas the empathetic and kind-hearted therapist will accidentally attribute too little free will, and in today's version of therapy, this will attempt to fix the person or provide therapy and try to categorize everything that's wrong with them, while overlooking their ability to overcome their disordered states. Now, as the psychologist Carl Rogers liked to emphasize, there is this idea of between the logical and the emotional side of things, there is the wise approach. And so we could think of the wise psychotherapist as recognizing this big picture and try to seek a delicate balance, emphasizing the idea of the brain's need to be taught how to instill a sense of agency and confidence to be able to apply the therapy in the first place. The brain and mind must be honed, and the individual must be taught how to make whatever form of bootstraps they can, given the resources they have and the kind of brain they have. So because people are not first taught how to establish this kind of free will and introspective abilities, they will most often do what I call the diagnostic default, or fall for the temptation to use diagnostic terminology to describe human encounters and human experiences to their detriment at times that are inappropriate. They'll accidentally and unknowingly use this label to describe themselves and explain their behaviors, explain their feelings and their mistakes in public behavior, and explain why they don't do well in society, essentially. There's great truth mixed in with unfortunately misleading information in psychology, providing explanations for misconduct and odd behavior, and this is most commonly seen in ADHD and autism, because these are giant spectrums that overlap with many of these human experiences. Many people end up adopting these labels to explain their experiences to their detriment. So ideally, the wise psychoanalyst will recognize this big picture, the temptations towards the diagnostic default, and kind of withhold the actual diagnostic terminology from the patient, and also being very careful not to overclassify people and not overuse diagnostic criteria themselves. Additionally, they'll ideally encourage a can-do attitude and this idea that people can pull themselves up by their bootstraps once they're given the capacity to build bootstraps. But ideally, they won't revert back to this level 3 of assuming that people can be invincible and just figure out how to make bootstraps for themselves, and committing the false equivalence fallacy, where we kind of equate all brains to be the same and to have the same ability to figure out how to heal themselves. The overall narrative is ideally one of instilling confidence and not an attitude of being beholden to our disorders or disordered states. But because we don't yet understand how the brain's self-healing mechanisms work and how the placebo effect works, it's best to encourage this kind of self-confidence building. We have to default to a mode of encouragement, but not invincibility. It's so delicate because as we go through the process of therapy, as opposed to concepts like life coaching or counseling or other approaches, when we go to ask these questions, it brings salience to the individual's experiences. It makes them realize that these are repeated experiences that they're having, and, well, now they have to start worrying about them. It brings all this to the surface and adds an emotional vocabulary to their experiences, and whereas that emotional vocabulary is very useful in instilling the kind of introspection that we want to instill in people, that can also work to our disadvantage, and it can make us hyper aware of our emotions in a way that is to our detriment, or in a way that's unhelpful to us. So this is why this has to be matched with the mindfulness. This is why the primary focus here is to begin therapy with introspection and self-awareness practices, ideally cognitive practices where we're able to recognize what the brain is sending us, but recognize the signals the brain's sending, and learn how to befriend those, or learn how to just be aware of which emotions are worth acknowledging and which aren't. Because if we do the opposite, if we classify every single emotion, and then we leave the patient with that information, then they take that home as these are the emotions to watch out for because I'm beholden to them, and they're just going to keep happening. And now I have this classification of ADHD, or these experiences that I'm having, these are things that are out of my control, essentially. Ideally, people will become more aware of their emotions and try to work on them, or they will default to using these vocabularies as a way to explain their disordered states, or the way that their brain is disordered, and just how their brain works. And this latter category seems to be what we're kind of falling into in the United States. This is similar to the way that I'm wary about the process of existential therapy. So it's very well discussed in the world of existential therapy that there is a risk in exacerbating and or instilling a person's existential crisis because you're talking about the existential crisis. So when we start to classify every single emotion and every single experience and physical behavior that a person encounters, that runs that risk of indeed exacerbating or instilling problems to begin with. And so this is why I believe that we have to have that prioritization of the mindfulness and practices that help instill introspective capacities. In therapy, we essentially introduce only one way of thinking about things, and this is, I want to say this is very relevant to United States therapy. In other cultures, there's more of a communal consideration, and there's other interpretations of how terms can be expressed and how the public thinks about the terms. And so when the culture encounters someone with schizophrenia, for example, there are many ways that they can respond to that can be to the individual's detriment as well. So for example, in Turkey, we have the term akil hastaligi, which means that's essentially like the more diagnostic and medical pathologizing approach to describing schizophrenia, as if this person is permanently like that and they should be avoided. And then there's another term, rushal hastagi, and this means it's more of a personal journey. This attributes the idea of a psychological illness in the way that it is an illness that people tend to go through, or an experience that people can have, and they will get past it at some point. And so when that latter category is taken up, people do not avoid, people don't shun the schizophrenic, or they don't shun the person, they don't use the term schizophrenia to begin with. They just use these two classifications. And there are a lot of studies on how this works in other cultures, but in the United States, well, I think you can see what I'm getting at. We have the pathologizing approach, where it is a medical disorder and an illness that is permanent. And this is why I try to use the term disordered states, because it is the brain entering a disordered state that ideally it will someday overcome, or at least learn to view as an advantage. And there's problems with the advantage terminology as well, because that also makes it sound like it's a permanent condition. So in psychotherapy, we risk introducing to the patient only one way of viewing their emotions and their feelings and their repeated behaviors. And if we aren't very, very careful to convey to them how these emotions do not own them and how these experiences don't own them, they'll see what we're doing and trying to classify all these experiences as criteria for disorder. And this will exacerbate the very conditions that we're trying to remedy. And in this process, the public has picked up this language, and so terms like rejection-sensitive dysphoria pop up. The neurotypicality versus neurodivergence terminology, all those are not even in the DSM-5. But because of this narrative that's developing around psychological health and mental health, this kind of beholden attitude is taking place and taking hold. And so the public conversation has kind of shifted into a misery loves company aspect, where we're creating echo chambers. As the suffering individuals find more mutual forms of suffering, they kind of rally together in groups of comfort. And this exacerbates this whole unhelpful, unproductive perception of themselves. And that's unfortunate. And again, this, like, the way I'm talking about this now can also get me thrown into the whole going back to stage one or level one bootstrap pulling ideologies, and like ableism, and like when I bring this up online and in these forums that I'm seeing in these groups that are in the thousands and even hundreds of thousands, I'm immediately shunned and put into the neurotypical camp. Now again, that's social media land, and it's very hard to have, I'm not having face-to-face one-on-one interactions with people, or I'm not uploading videos like this in those conversations. And I've recently just stepped out of that whole world because it is quite toxic to me and to my mental health, it seems, and I have to make my decisions on that. But what I'm trying to emphasize is that this idea of the path of least resistance, we know that the brain does this. We have the whole compartmentalizing aspect of the brain. We have the temptations towards the path of least resistance, and when we provide 560 plus diagnostic terms out into the public, people will adopt those, and they will attribute those to excuse their actions unnecessarily and at inappropriate times, and also classify their behaviors so that they don't have to continue the more arduous and energy-consuming activity of introspection and self-growth. And so this is where we have the kind of the dichotomy arising between the self-help guru and the self-help therapist. Like we see a lot of the UK-based classes that I've taken have come across in this way too, and I see people slipping into these dichotomies where it's like they just completely deny disorders altogether, and they stay at that level 1 or level 3 abstraction level of the political aspects of this, and they stay in that bootstrap category where like people can just pull themselves or like figure out how to help themselves, and you can just deny all disorders or deny all of your emotions because stoicism works. And again, that's a big misinterpretation of stoicism as well, but that's for another video. It is unfortunate that this is the direction this has gone, because there's the term medical gaslighting that I see popping up in the U.S. So when people hear that, like, we have a very well trained ear, and we kind of like sniff that out really easily when our therapist is being ableist, or when our therapist starts victim blaming or blaming you for your inability to handle your trauma and that kind of thing. And so we put this in gentle language of like, our trauma does not own us, and our trauma's pain is for our traumatizer to bear. I really like that language from Gabor Mate. But what's happened, even with that gentle language, and even with that encouraging language, we still have people using the term trauma in a way that's extremely counterproductive. In a way, like, people are saying, I just saw a recent post. It said the traumatized urge to explain yourself multiple times until someone understands you. How is the urge to explain yourself related to trauma? So we're bridging these gaps, and we're taking up these terms, and they're becoming overused. And this, again, we're bewitched by language, like Wittgenstein put it. We don't question labels very easily. Even what I'm doing now with all these highfalutin terms and vernacular, like, I have to use these terms too. The self-help guru and the echo chambers, like, that term didn't used to exist until a few years ago. But those get in at some very real points, and this is the problem with language in general, especially English language, is that it's very descriptive, very categorizing, and categorical. And sometimes that gets at things that are very real, and sometimes it gets at feelings and experiences that are very real to the individual. But it may not behoove us to consider those as always real, or always dominating us, I should say. And then there are also terms that are just completely misleading. And there are terms that are unhelpful and unproductive and counterintuitive to employ. And there are methods of arriving at those terms that are counterintuitive and counterproductive to try to go for. I believe autism is definitely one of these. I just had a conversation with an individual recently who said that she refuses to have any interactions with humans because she is schizophrenic, or because she identifies with the label of schizophrenia. And she's reported doing research on psychology and doing research into schizophrenia most of her time, is what she's spending her days doing that. And also astrology. And, well, this is getting at the idea of exacerbating. Like, the more that you look into that world, the more that you gaze into the abyss of psychoanalysis, I guess I could say, the more that can exacerbate and reinforce the idea that you are that thing. That is the label that you identify with. So various therapies like CBT and RABT and DBT tend to encourage that questioning of labels and the questioning of the titles that we place on ourselves. But again, in the West, as it is, especially the U.S., we have the culture's emphasis is on this idea of individualism and egotism, or egotistical conceptions of, I need to identify as this thing. I am a maintenance technician. I am a public speaker. I am a CEO. I am a schizophrenic person. I am an ADHD person. So that's deeply embedded in us, and that default to that, like, our defaulting, or the brain's temptation to default to these terms, is just so embedded in us. So even if the therapist does a good job of communicating this bigger picture to the patient, the brain's temptations towards this path of least resistance often win. And this is especially true in a society that's heavily laden with these kind of classifications. I call this the diagnostic default, and I want to emphasize that this is not laziness. This is not, you're not good enough. It's just the fact that we have very little free will, and we need to be taught that. We have limited capacity to figure out how to make boots, and we have to be taught how to make them. It takes literally more metabolic energy for the brain to continuously sustain cognitive dissonance in a way that allows the individual the agency necessary to make improvements on themselves.